We did it! Room 5 of the dungeon, final room. Alright, the presentation on this one is going to be a little bit different. There's not all that much crafting to do for this final encounter. What I am going to do is throw some gameplay statistics at you, some mechanics, and just wrap up the story and the whole encounter in a really cool and fun way. Now there's a bit of crafting, we're going to have a little bit of fun with it, I'll show you a few things, but it's not going to be as intense as the others where the story's pretty much wrapped up. I think you'll like where it goes from here. Alright, that's enough talking. Let's just jump in. So, with the final spell cast and the final sword swung, the ghostly butler lets out a keening, awful howl of death as one of your party steps up to grab the book from his hands. He looks them in the eye, his horrible gaze dead into theirs, and speaks the last words he ever will on this plane, willing the entire dungeon to collapse around him. It's sort of like a legendary action more than a spell, since spells can be counterspelled, and we can't have our climax being counterspelled. So this is a legendary action that the butler has because of his tie to this place. What happens then? Well, as your party looks around at each other, relieved nothing is happening. The walls of the crypt begin to shake, dust rattles from all of the cracks and crevices, and stones begin to crumble from the ceiling. With even the tiniest of wisdom checks, they know, well, we gotta get the hell out of here. So they book it back to the front of the dungeon. That's right, you're gonna run them through every room over again. But this time, they've got stones crumbling from above, trying to crush them, and lances of spectral light blasting out of the floor, trying to sear the flesh from their bones. No one is leaving with that book. So we're going to revisit each room. And the coolest thing about this is actually that your players are going to tell you what the coolest thing about this is. You're going to be throwing checks at them to dodge rubble, to avoid these spectral lances, and you're going to let them tell you how they do it. So characters who have movement abilities, that really, those don't come up much, right? Yeah, they're a little useful in combat, kind of, but they're not really a big deal breaker, and yet some classes get them as a huge part of their kit. Well, here, they get to use those movement abilities to dodge around boulders that are trying to crash down on them, or to just make it to the end of an entire room while the rest of the party's still at the start. It's a pretty huge advantage. Alternately, maybe your wizard or sorcerer wants to burn the last couple spells they have to protect themselves, or the party, or to teleport out, or anything, really. Maybe the barbarian wants to just catch the rubble that's falling towards his head and toss it away, just as a show of raw strength. All of your players get to tell you what they think is cool about their character and decide in character how they'd handle this obstacle. In the moment you make up the check that goes with it, make it difficult but not too punishing. You don't really want them to die here in the final leg of the journey, but it's always a possibility if the dice are cruel. You do want them to get out, but you want to give them a chance to be creative. And make some notes, because the players will use this opportunity to show off something about their character that they don't normally get to show off. And you can jot it down either in actual physical notes or just, remember it. But this is something that they think is awesome about their character that they would like to see used. And you can always use that in future dungeons. Give them a way to show off. At long last, the adventuring party emerges from the crypt, prized tome in hand. They come back out into the damp and grim graveyard, where the scholar is waiting for them, surrounded by a pack of hired cutthroats. Now, when the players wonder what's going on, he will try to bluff them. He'll try to tell them, I didn't think you were coming back. I hired them to go in after you. I just wanted to be sure. It's really important that I get the book. You're going to give it to me, aren't you? Of course, that's going to set off alarm bells. Chances are your players are not going to hand over the book, even if he does offer to pay them. Now, they know exactly what this book is now, and frankly, it's not in the nature of adventurers to hand over magic items to just random people who probably can't overpower them. But that's what the sellswords are for. If pressed, the scholar will explain that he's actually the last surviving cousin of the family. The book is his by right, and he will take it from you if he has to. Now, this can go a few different ways. Chances are your players saw this betrayal coming because betrayals like this happen a fair bit. But if you want to, this is how you can have it lead into a broader part of your campaign. You can have your players robbed of the book. Maybe one of the mercenaries has spells they can use to get the book from the players, or maybe there's just a lot of them and they're really tough. Now, they're not going to kill the adventurers, they just want the book. But if you wanted to trail this into a longer part of the campaign, you could have the scholar or the last surviving family member take the book right off into the sunset and start making trouble. Of course, the players are going to feel obligated to stop him, either out of personal responsibility or because, hey, that's their book, they earned it, they should be the ones making trouble, so they're going to ride off after him. Either way, it's an easy way to loop this into a larger part of your campaign, or it could even be a whole campaign on its own. But before we can worry about something like that, we have to actually make this stuff. Since we're running back through the dungeon and reusing the rooms, we don't have a lot to craft here, but we are going to need some rubble and some necrotic spectral lances to assault our players with as they hastily make their way backwards into an ambush. So we can start by taking a piece of leftover foam and starting to cut some bases out of it. I used scissors to get some round organic sort of shapes from the foam, and then once the paper backing is peeled off, it's pretty simple to use a craft knife to bevel the edges of the bases so that they'll be less jarring and more natural looking when added to the other terrain. I made a few more of these bases than I needed for the rubble, since I intend to use them for my spectral lances too, and it's a good idea to work in batches whenever you can. Next, I cut a lot of random jagged shapes from the foam to work as the fallen pieces of wall and ceiling. This is what we're going to start to build our stacks of rubble out of. It's going to provide the bulk of the shape and structure for that. Then all of it, the bases and the rubble pieces, gets textured with the old tinfoil ball method. Now, if you're going to do this at home, make sure that the rubble bits get textured on both sides. Depending on how you stack them later, both sides might be visible, so you want them both textured. I set aside the bases for the spectral lances for now as I start to put together the fallen rubble. Using a crappy old brush, I spread tacky glue all over the base. I grab a few of my bits of crumbling rubble and just sort of play with stacking them on top of each other until they sit in a way that I like. Then I glue them in place. After that, it's back once more to our container of small stones and sack of dirt. And those both just get sprinkled over top, just add texture. The glue we've already spread on the base is going to be enough to hold those in place once it dries. Once that glue is dry, everything gets coated in a mix of Mod Podge and black paint, and from there, well, you know what's next. It's the standard paint scheme for this dungeon. All of the rubble and the bases for the lances gets painted with a medium gray, dry brushed with a light gray, and hit with a black wash. While I do that, I want to take a moment to thank my Patreon supporters. Your continued support is a huge boost to both myself and the channel, and you're a huge part of what makes this possible and what encourages me to push for more and better over and over. I appreciate you. And speaking of more and better, I do want to make an announcement as well. Dungeons and Drybrushing is going to be rebranding. We're changing our name, our logo, and kind of doing a soft relaunch of the channel. Now, this won't be until February, but I don't want anyone confused when they see a new name and logo on the channel, so I'll be mentioning it periodically between now and then. On top of all that, I also want to say that the next time I craft an entire dungeon like this, and that shouldn't be too far off, I already have a new challenge set up, and you folks dropped some great ideas for themes, I'll also be releasing a PDF to go with it on the Patreon. The PDF will include writing to read out to your players to help set the mood, pictures of the finished rooms, advice on how to run them, and even custom enemies that we're going to craft here on the channel with custom stat blocks. So look forward to that in the new year, and if you want to be sure to see it, go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't already. For our spectral lances, I'm going to bust out another inexpensive dollar store spell effect. I'm just going to take some hot glue sticks and carve them down. Be careful when you're doing this. Take it slow and pull the knife away from you, not toward. You don't need amazing control or precision to get the effect I'm going for, and it's much more important in the end to keep the use of your thumbs. I carved 2 of these spectral lances and then use hot glue to make sort of like plasma trails where the energy for them is coalescing on the ground, and then glue the lances down in the center of them. Once the glue is cooled, they get hit with some watered down green paint to help retain some of that ghostly translucency. And that brings us to the end of the 5-room dungeon. Now, personally, I love little skill challenges like this where your players get to freeform solutions. Which of their characters' abilities do they want to use to avoid the rubble and the spectral blasts? If another player fails a roll and is at low HP, is someone going to try to jump in and push them out of the way and take the hit themselves? How do you work as a team to get out? And what is it that you think is cool about your character's kit that you don't get to show off much? At the end of a dungeon after a dark story and what could be a pretty harrowing fight, giving your players a lighthearted way to show off how badass they are is a high note to end on. Thank you all for coming along on this 5-room dungeon journey with me and for all your feedback along the way. I appreciate you watching and your support. If you want to support the channel further, there are a few ways to do that below, including the Patreon, but one of the best ones is just by hitting like, hitting subscribe, and leaving a comment. I'd love to hear what you think. And I've got some more awesome crafting videos coming up that I'm really excited to share with you. Thanks, and I'll see you on the next one.